In this video, we are going to look into the concept of idea of self. And while we currently take the idea of self for granted, this was not always the case. In the Middle Ages, people's identities were linked to their social positions, occupations, and family ties. And people were not supposed to want to change these. People knew their identities since these were largely detected by their family or by their place in society. Also, the issue of personal development did not arise in the sense in which it is a major issue for many people today. People learned their occupation, many had their marriages arranged by their families. In Western Judeo Christian society, most people were guided by Christian values and beliefs. They had faith in God and a belief that leading in good and sinless life would lead to salvation in their afterlife. They had faith in their monarch and a belief that if they fulfill their duties within their society, the monarch would protect and not punish them. These constraints did not leave a great deal of scope for personal development nor to a concern with individual differences in personal growth. During the early modern period, which is 1500 to 1800, an interest developed in differences between people and the uniqueness of the individual. Autobiographical writing and a focus on the detailed differences between people's life experiences began to emerge. This later gave way to focus on the inner life and to the belief that fulfillment might be enhanced by developing a deeper understanding of the inner life of the self through art, culture, contemplation, and poetry. This coincided with an emerging questioning of the certainties of religion, monarchies, and the values entailed by these. People began to question their faith in their gods, their kings, and their values. Democracy also began to supplant monarchies with the idea that the people choose their leaders rather than being appointed by God. At the turn of the 19th century, the popularization of the idea of the unconscious through the works of Sigmund Freud expanded the popular concept of the inner self and the idea that achieving self knowledge and personal development were challenging undertakings. Life cycle theorists such as Erik Erikson later proposed the idea that at transitional points between the stages of development of the life cycle, identity crisis could occur in which people questioned the way that they were living their lives and entertained choices about making major changes in their lifestyles. This idea of an identity crisis entailed the view that the self was separate from the social and religious context in which it resided. This way of thinking was facilitated by the rise in geographic, social, and occupational mobility. It was also supported by increasing wealth, which gave freedom to entertain the idea of choosing different lifestyles. Wealth and mobility, in turn, were facilitated by huge advances in science and technology, which were made as a result of the scientific revolution. While the emergence of the modern conception of self has been liberating on the one hand, it has also entailed a cost because it has become increasingly difficult to put all one's faith in the supernatural order or the social order. People are forced to look elsewhere for values, and many turn to the self or close personal relationships as a source of value. Relationship will be dealt later. Here, the focus will be on the self. Whereas in the past, a focus on the self was termed selfishness, a pejorative term. There are many positive terms for self focused concerns in modern psychology, notable self knowledge, self esteem, self efficacy, self evaluation, and self regulation. Many of these are of concern to positive psychology. Self as an object and an agent. This distinction between self as an object and self as a subject or agent is a consistent theme throughout the literature on the psychology of self. Some features of these two aspects of the self are underpins constructs from social, cognitive, behavioral, and narrative psychology such as self-concept, self-schemas, self as a set of learned skill, self as narrative, self as constructed in language, and the self as a socially constructed and culturally determined phenomenon. The self as agent theme is central to the theories in the evolutionary tradition that highlight the biological underpinning of the self as a conscious agent with the capacity to perceive, learn, communicate, and adapt to the environment. The self as an agent theme also underpins the psychoanalytic conceptions of the self as motivated to achieve conflicting goals such as aggressive self preservation, sexual self reproduction, and social cooperation. In contrast, the notion of ideal selves or possible selves as goals to be pursued are entailed by a conception of the self as an object rather than an agent. Research on both aspects of self, particularly research on self evaluation and self regulation, have pinpointed strengths of importance to positive psychology. High self esteem and strong self efficacy beliefs, entailed by the view of self as object, contribute to personal strength and resilience. We have better health and well being when we evaluate ourselves positively and believe that we will succeed at tasks we attempt. Coping effectively with life challenges and using adaptive defense mechanisms to manage intrapsychic conflict are entailed by the view of self as an agent. We have better health and well being when we use certain types of coping strategies to manage life's challenges and certain types of defense mechanisms to manage anxiety arising from conflicting sexual, aggressive, and social motives. The issues will be the main focus in the current video. William James in 1890 defined self esteem as the feeling of self worth that derives from the ratio of our actual successes to our pretensions. By pretensions, he meant our estimation of our potential successes, and this is informed by our values, goals, and aspirations. This definition of self esteem highlights that it is a construct which addresses the way we evaluate ourselves and measure our own sense of self worth by comparing how we are and how we aspire to be. Self esteem is not a unitary construct but is hierarchically organized with overall global self esteem based on general judgments of self worth and subtypes of self esteem based on evaluations of self worth in different contexts, such as within the family, school, work setting, leisure setting, or peer group. To measure self esteem, multidimensional self report self esteem questionnaires are useful. Self esteem profiles across a number of domains can be assessed, particularly well designed, reliable, and valid scales are O'Brien and Epstein's multidimensional self esteem inventory for adults and Battle's culture free self esteem inventories for children and adults. O'Brien and Epstein's multidimensional self-esteem inventory was developed in 1988 for adults is very comprehensive and yields scores for global self-esteem, competence, lovability, likability, personal power, self-control, moral self-approval, body appearance, body functioning, identity integration, and defensive self-esteem enhancement. Battle's cultural free self esteem inventory, developed in 1992 for children, yields scores for global self esteem, parental self esteem, school based self esteem, and peer group related self esteem. The culture free self esteem inventory for adults measures global self esteem, social self esteem, and personal self esteem. Both versions also contain a lie scale which measures defensive responding. Unidimensional self-esteem scale useful for screening purposes include Rosenberg self-esteem inventory for children, Newgate Thomas self-esteem rating scale for adults and children, Cooper-Smith's self-esteem inventories for adults and children. Self-concept inventories measure self-perception, and some researchers have used them as indices of self-esteem. The Pierce and Harris Children's self-concept scale and the Tennessee self-concept scales for adults and children are among the more psychometrically robust measures of self-concept. We will now look into the development of self-esteem. Reviews of our current knowledge about self-esteem allows a number of conclusions to be drawn concerning the development of self-evaluative beliefs. Children whose parents are accepting of their strengths and limitations and set explicit high but attainable standards which they support their children in attaining develop high self-esteem. High self esteem is also associated with a consistent authoritative parenting style and where children are treated with warmth and respect and given opportunities to discuss directives and rules about good conduct. In contrast, children whose parents are inconsistent, permissive, strictly authoritarian, rejecting, or abusive develop low self esteem. Parental example and modeling also has an impact on the development of self esteem, a greater impact than the verbal advice parents give their children. Parents who cope with life challenges by using an active problem solving coping skills are more likely through their example to help their children develop high self esteem. An avoidant parental coping style is associated with the development of low self esteem in children. Self esteem is also influenced by their wider social factors, notably socioeconomic status. Higher socioeconomic status is associated with high self esteem, and poverty is associated with lower self esteem. Higher self esteem is associated with achievement, not failure. Having the power and skills to influence others, acting in a way we perceive to be moral, and being accepted and approved of by others. Thus, the self esteem derives from our own evaluations of our worth based on the appraisal of our personal accomplishments, virtues, and attributes, as well as from our perceptions of the way we are evaluated by others. Self esteem is relatively stable over time but may change at life cycle transition points. Self esteem tends to be high in preschoolers, it then declines gradually during the pre adolescent years. This gradual decline may be due to greater reliance on social comparison information and feedback from external sources such as peers and teachers. The stability of self esteem is in part due to the ways in which people process information about the self. When people are processing information of particular relevance to how they evaluate themselves, the way information is processed appears to be driven by four motives: self enhancement, maintaining a consistent view of the self, maintaining a socially approved view of the self, and maintaining an accurate view of the self. People tend to be motivated to process information in a biased way that supports a particularly positive view of themselves. They also interpret available information in a biased way that is consistent with the views they typically have of themselves. In addition, people are motivated to process information and present themselves in ways that increase the approval they receive from significant members of their social networks. People are motivated to process information accurately. When faced with the new information about the self, people with high self esteem will process that information in a biased, self enhancing way, consistent with their positive view of the self and their wish to gain the approval of others. People with low self esteem, in contrast, will selectively attend to new information which confirms their existing negative self evaluations. A number of factors have been shown to characterize people with high and low levels of self esteem. High self esteem is associated with good personal adjustment across the lifespan, positive effectivity, personal autonomy, androgyny, internal locus of control, greater self knowledge, setting appropriate goals, fulfilling personal commitments, coping well with criticism or negative feedback, managing stress well, and showing low levels of self criticism and criticism of others. Low self esteem is associated with poor psychological adjustment, a variety of mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, drug abuse, eating disorders, difficulties making and maintaining stable relationship, poor stress management, poor immune system functioning under stress, and suicide. People with high levels of self esteem are concerned mainly with enhancing their views of themselves and seek opportunities to excel and stand out. If they receive negative feedback on laboratory tasks, they persist for a while and then abandon the task if they continue to fail. However, people with low self esteem are concerned with self protection and avoiding failure, humiliation, or rejection. If they fail on laboratory tasks, they tend to persist until they succeed. Thus, people with high self esteem have the overall goal of enhancing their views of themselves by focusing on their strengths and keeping opportunities to use these to be outstanding. Whereas people with low self esteem aim to find out about their shortcomings so that they can remediate these in order to be adequate and avoidance failure. Some people report high self esteem as a defense against negative social evaluation. O'Brien and Epstein's multidimensional self esteem inventory for adults include a subscale for assessing defensive self esteem enhancement. Defensively, high self esteem may be characterized by extreme sensitivity to criticism and bragging and criticizing others on the one hand, or immersion in work and responding to criticism with inappropriate aggression on the other. These profiles are quite different from the depressed, anxious, and socially withdrawn person with low self esteem. There are two types of defensive self esteem. People with these types of self esteem behave in many contexts like people with high self esteem. However, when their vulnerabilities are challenged, they behave in ways that are not consistent with high self esteem. The first type of defensive self esteem is associated with low competence but a high sense of worth. Such people have extreme sensitivity to criticism because of their sense of incompetence and inadequacy. When they feel that their competence is being challenged, to defend against anxiety associated with their sense of inadequacy in this area, they may brag, reflecting the use of defense mechanism of overcomposition. Or they may criticize and blame others, which reflects the defensive displacement of self directed criticism onto others. Self centered people have a moderate level of this type of self esteem. In its extreme form, this type of adaptation is associated with narcissistic personality disorder. The second type of defensive self esteem is associated with high competence but a low sense of worth. Such people have extreme sensitivity to criticism of their worth because of their underlying sense of unworthiness. When they feel that their worth is being challenged, to defend against anxiety associated with a low sense of self worth, such people may become immersed in their work and produce an exceptional number of competent achievements, thereby using sublimation as a defense. Their workaholic behavior reflects an attempt to compensate for a low sense of worthiness through overachievement. Alternatively, they may respond to criticism and threats to their worthiness with bullying and inappropriate aggression, thereby using antisocial acting out as a defense. There are a number of strategies for uh, improving self-esteem derived from William James as the ratio of achievements to aspirations. Chris Mark's competence and worthiness model of self-esteem. These include skill training, environmental change, cognitive therapy, and capitalizing upon transitions that promote self-esteem. Skills training may increase competence. This includes training in problem solving skills, social skills, assertiveness skills, academic skills, and work related skills depending on the area of low competence. Where a low sense of worthiness derives from poverty or social disadvantage, environmental stages such as occupational retraining, occupation placement, or social relocation to a less disadvantaged area may be appropriate. Where a low sense of worthiness is due to unrealistically high aspirations, despite a realistic level of achievement, then cognitive therapy may be required to help challenge their very high standards. People with low self esteem have a cognitive bias to filter out positive feedback, inconsistence with negative self evaluation, and cognitive therapy helps people recalibrate this filter. Only when skills for challenging unrealistically high standards and screening out positive feedback have been acquired can people accept positive affirming feedback, recognize the value of the achievements that derive from newly learned problem solving or social skills, or capitalize upon transitional points in their lives that have the potential for fostering self esteem. While self esteem is concerned with global evaluations of self worth and self efficacy, we can also look into specific competencies with focal evaluations.